Before we begin, hit subscribe, like, and drop a comment, because what you about to hear is one of the most shocking real-world prison food operations hidden deep inside Japan's justice system. And trust me, once you hear how prisoner 40181 gets his daily meal, you'll never look at prison food the same way again. The steam was so thick you could taste the metal in it. Industrial mixers roared like engines in a shipyard. And in the center of the chaos, chained at the wrists, stood prisoner 40181, a man who looked more like a machine than a human after years of factory line labor. He moved fast, too fast for someone wearing issued slippers on a slippery concrete floor. Scoop, drop, press, seal. Every motion razor-sharp, synchronized, robotic, because one mistake in this underground food processing block didn't just mean losing your meal. It meant losing fingers. A guard slammed his baton on the steel railing overhead. Faster. We're behind schedule. But 40181 didn't flinch. His eyes stayed locked on the conveyor of ingredients rushing by. Dehydrated rice, preserved vegetables, nutrient-paste blocks, and processed fish that smelled more like chemicals than ocean. Their daily meal, the same meal fed to over 2,000 inmates in the facility, started right here, under fluorescent lights that buzzed like insects. Then came the moment. A siren, short, sharp, different from the usual end-of-shift alarm, echoed through the chamber. Every prisoner froze. Even the guards took a step back, because they all knew what that sound meant. Someone had messed with the food line. And when that happened, someone usually disappeared. 40,181's heart hammered as a container slid toward him, one he hadn't filled, one he didn't recognize. Its seal was crooked. Its weight was wrong. He pressed his fingers against the lid. Still warm, freshly tampered with. He looked up, and across the line, another inmate stared at him, eyes hollow, trembling, silently begging him not to open it. And that's when 40,181 realized. This wasn't about food. This wasn't about work. This was a warning. A warning meant specifically for him. The guard above shouted, "Open it. Now." And just as 40,181's hand began to peel the lid back, everything went black. Not because the lights cut out, not because he passed out, but because someone grabbed him from behind, dragged him off the line, and whispered the words that would change everything. If you want to stay alive in this prison, never eat what you make. That was the moment his nightmare began. But to understand why prisoner 40181 became a target, why the food line was more dangerous than the yard, and how inmates in Japan's maximum security blocks really get their daily meals, we have to go back to the day he entered the prison for the crime he swore he didn't commit. Prisoner 40181 wasn't always just a number. Before the steel doors and the factory line meals, he was Tadao Mori, a soft-spoken warehouse clerk from Yokohama who barely raised his voice, let alone a weapon. But the morning he arrived at Kirohane Detention Center, every last piece of his old life was stripped away, starting with his name. The drive to the prison felt endless. The van's windows were completely blacked out, the metal floor vibrating with every bump in the road. Tadao sat cuffed between two other inmates. One was whispering prayers, his voice a low, desperate hum. The other stared straight ahead, silent, as if he'd already accepted he wasn't leaving this place alive. The moment the van doors swung open, freezing mountain air slapped their faces. And there it was, Kirohane, a gray concrete fortress carved into the side of a mountain. It wasn't what you'd expect from a prison. There was no graffiti, no barbed wire curling wildly over the walls. Just smooth, cold concrete and observation towers that looked almost surgical. It felt clinical, like a place built not for punishment, but for absolute, suffocating control. Guards immediately started shouting orders in clipped, impersonal tones. Single file. No talking. Eyes forward. Inside, they were funneled through a series of metal detectors and scanners, then herded into a room lit with harsh, unforgiving strip lights. Behind a glass panel sat a prison officer dressed entirely in white, almost like a doctor. He tapped keys on a keyboard without even looking up. "Name?" he asked. "Tadao Mori," he replied. The officer paused. "Not anymore." He pressed a button, and a small printer spat out a plastic strip. A guard grabbed it and slapped it onto Tadao's wrist. It read, 40181. His entire identity, his life, reduced to 5 digits. It didn't take long for him to realize that things worked differently here. In most prisons, The chaos comes from the inmates, gangs, fights, power struggles. But at Kirohane, the chaos came from the staff. The rules were so rigid, so impossibly strict, that they bent reality itself. Meals were timed to the exact second. Sleep was monitored by sensors. Every movement, from walking to the showers to lining up for count, was rehearsed like a bizarre, silent choreography. And the one thing that every inmate dreaded? The work rotation. In Japan's most controlled prisons, inmates aren't just expected to work, they are required to. It's part of the system of rehabilitation, or as the inmates saw it, of breaking them down. Every new arrival was evaluated, tested, and sorted like parts on an assembly line. Laundry, carpentry, assembly, and for the unlucky ones, food processing block 3, a place the inmates whispered about, calling it the Iron Kitchen. Tadao didn't know it yet, but the Iron Kitchen was where inmates burned out, broke down, or broke the rules just to feel alive. He didn't know that this single kitchen fed the entire prison, making it the most critical and high-pressure job in Kirohane. And he certainly didn't know that a hidden shadow economy thrived right under the noses of the guards, an economy that used meals as currency, as leverage, and sometimes as a weapon for retaliation. All he knew was that after a brief, sterile interview, a guard flipped through his file, frowned, and circled one line with a red pen. Previous warehouse experience. The guard looked up from the paper, his eyes cold and empty. "You'll fit right in," he said. It wasn't a compliment. Later that night, as prisoner 40181 sat cross-legged on his thin futon, the reality of his new life settled over him like a prison-issued blanket. Heavy, scratchy, and suffocating. In the cells around him, he could hear the faint sounds of men breathing, shifting in their sleep, muttering in their dreams. The entire cell block seemed to hum with a quiet, collective dread. The lights snapped off at exactly 9 p.m., plunging the world into darkness. He closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, his mind kept replaying a single moment from earlier that day, the quick, almost imperceptible glance exchanged between two guards when they read his file. It was a look that didn't feel random at all. It was a look that felt like they knew something he didn't. As if the assignment to the food processing unit wasn't just a work placement, but a setup. And deep inside, for the first time since his arrest, Tadao felt a cold, sharp fear creep into his bones. A fear that would later make perfect, terrifying sense. Because the next morning, when he stepped into the Iron Kitchen for the very first time, he would discover the one rule every inmate learned sooner or later. In Kirohane, food wasn't just survival. It was power. And someone had already decided how his story was going to end. Thanks for watching. If you want to see what happens next in the Iron Kitchen, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss it. The doors to food processing block 3 opened with a hydraulic hiss, like the lungs of some great, mechanical beast. The moment I stepped inside, the heat slammed into me. This wasn't the familiar warmth of a kitchen. This was industrial heat, the kind that clung to your skin, filled your throat, and made the air feel thick enough to chew. The smell hit me next. A strange cocktail of steamed rice, harsh disinfectant, and hot metal. But beneath it all, there was something else. A faint, sour scent that was just plain wrong. Rows of inmates in identical light blue uniforms moved in perfect, synchronized rhythm. Scooping, sealing, packing. A flawless machine of human parts. Nothing wasted. No one talking. Each man was chained to a floor rail, a short leash that kept him tethered to his station. Guards watched from elevated platforms, their gazes sweeping over us like zookeepers overseeing a pen of dangerous animals. As I was led to my new post, a veteran inmate with a shaved head and eyes that had seen too much glanced at me. His voice was a dry whisper, barely audible over the hum of the machinery. "Don't fall behind." "Why?" I asked, my own voice sounding small and foreign in the oppressive space. He just looked at me. "You'll see." I didn't understand then, but I would, and much sooner than I expected. A guard barked out from the platform above. "Position 19. You're on inspection duty." That was me. 40181, number 19. Inspection duty sounded harmless, maybe even important. A chance to do something other than just mindlessly scoop and pack. But the veteran inmate gave me a look I couldn't decipher, a strange mix of fear and pity. "Bad luck," he mouthed. One of the floor guards handed me a thin metal pick and a pair of insulated gloves. Check the seals on the bento trays, he instructed, his tone bored and mechanical. Anything loose, anything leaking, set it aside. He then leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial low. And if you see something you shouldn't, forget you saw it. That warning unsettled me far more than the heat or the chains. It coiled in my gut like a cold snake. I took my place along the conveyor line, the endless river of meal trays. They rolled toward me, steaming and identical. A block of white rice, a small portion of pickled vegetables, and a thin, pale strip of what they called fish paste. This was the fuel that ran Kirohane prison, the same meal fed to every prisoner, 3 times a day, every single day. At first, the work was as monotonous as I'd expected. Predictable, mechanical. My hands moved on their own, checking seals, pushing trays along. My mind started to drift. But then I saw it. Tray number 212. The plastic seal was perfect, but the rice looked off. It was darker than the rest. Not burnt, not spoiled in a way I could recognize. Just wrong. It had a strange, grayish tint that made the hairs on my arm stand up. I remembered the guard's words, but my gut screamed louder. I used the pick to slide the tray off the main line and onto the rejection rack. Across from me, the veteran inmate froze for half a second. It was a micro-expression, a flicker of movement, so small you'd miss it unless you were watching for it. His eyes darted to my rejected tray, then back to his work, his face a mask of stone. I tried to ignore it and continued. A few moments later, I found another, and then another. By the time tray number 224 came around, the pattern was unmistakable. Someone was tampering with the food. It wasn't random spoilage. And it wasn't all of the food, not enough to trigger a mass illness that would draw immediate attention. It was just a few trays scattered throughout the line. Targeted. Suddenly, the entire conveyor system jolted to a violent stop. The deafening noise was replaced by a tense, ringing silence. Every head in the room snapped up. Then, a siren blared. A piercing, electronic shriek that vibrated through the concrete floor. It was the same siren I would later hear on the day everything went dark, the day the world ended inside these walls. But this was my first time hearing it. And unlike everyone else in that room, I didn't know the unwritten rule. When the siren goes off, you don't move. You don't breathe. You don't do anything to attract attention. Heavy boots stomped toward my station. A guard pointed a finger directly at me. Who flagged these trays? He roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous room. I swallowed, my throat suddenly bone dry. I did, I managed to say. The guard's jaw tightened into a hard knot. You sure about that? All around me, the other inmates kept their eyes fixed on the floor. Motionless. Silent statues of blue. The guard stepped over to the rejection rack and inspected the trays I had set aside. I watched his face, searching for a reaction. For a single moment, his eyelid twitched. Just once. It was a small tell, but it was there. He then turned and looked at me with a stare so cold, it could have frozen the steam rising from the trays. Put your hands behind your back. I hesitated, confusion warring with a rising sense of panic. What did I do? The guard leaned in close, his breath hot and sour against my ear, whispering so only I could hear. You weren't supposed to catch these. Before I could even process his words, 2 other guards grabbed my arms, their grips like iron clamps. Another one was reaching for his baton. My mind went blank with terror. But then, the veteran inmate across from me did the unthinkable. He broke the cardinal rule of survival in this place. He spoke up. Sir, he said, his voice shaking but clear. He's new. He doesn't know the sorting order yet. A dangerous, heavy silence fell over the room. The lead guard raised his head slowly, his eyes narrowing into slits as he focused on the veteran. Are you volunteering for extra duty? He asked, his voice dripping with menace. The veteran's face paled, but he held the guard's gaze and nodded. Yes, sir. The guards exchanged a look I couldn't read. After a long moment, the ones holding me released my arms. Next time you flag something, one of them growled, make sure it's a real problem. The siren cut off, and with another lurch, the conveyor belt restarted. As the familiar hum filled the room, the veteran let out a shaky breath. You just got protected, he muttered, not looking at me. Protected from what? I whispered back. His eyes flickered towards the guards, then back to the trays. From seeing too much. I didn't sleep that night. It wasn't because of the oppressive heat, and it wasn't because of the lingering echo of the siren. It was because I kept replaying the look in the guard's eyes. It wasn't anger. It wasn't annoyance. It was fear. He wasn't afraid of me or any of the inmates. He was afraid of what was inside those trays. And there, deep in the belly of Kirohane prison, I finally understood the chilling truth. Someone wasn't just controlling our food. They were using it, testing something, on us, and for reasons I didn't yet understand. I had just been noticed by the very last people in this prison you'd ever want to notice you. My life, I realized, had just become infinitely more complicated and a whole lot more dangerous. This was only the next morning. 40181 walked into the iron kitchen with a heavy knot tightening in his stomach. It felt like a different place today. The oppressive heat from the industrial cookers felt even harsher. The clang of metal on metal seemed louder, and the eyes of the other inmates felt sharper, more pointed. It was as if everyone around him knew something he didn't, a secret that hovered just out of his reach. He still couldn't piece it all together. Why were those trays tampered with? Who was behind it, and what did they want? A brief water break offered a moment of quiet chaos. That's when the veteran inmate from the line, the one who'd silently watched him yesterday, found him. He sidled up, his movements economical, his eyes scanning the room. "You almost died yesterday," he said, his voice a low whisper that barely cut through the noise. 40181 frowned, confused. For what? For spotting some bad rice. The veteran shook his head slowly, a grim look on his face. "No," he corrected. "For stepping into a fight you don't understand." 40181 followed the man's subtle gaze across the sprawling kitchen. It landed on the far corner of the processing block, a section where a specific group of inmates worked under conditions that seemed unusual. Their supervision was strangely relaxed. There were no heavy chains clinking around their ankles. No guards were screaming orders at them. They moved with a confidence, an almost arrogant swagger, as if they owned the iron kitchen. They were a world apart from the rest of the prisoners. "That's Team Hakamoto," the veteran whispered, his voice dropping even lower. 40181 looked back at him, a question in his eyes. "Their job?" The veteran paused, letting the weight of the moment hang in the air. "They control the meal." 40181 was still lost. It didn't make any sense. "Control it how?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Allocation. Quality," the veteran explained, ticking off the points mentally. "Extra portions for guards they like. Spoiled ones for inmates they don't." He leaned in closer, his breath warm against 40,181's ear. And sometimes they send messages." A cold dread washed over 40,181. His breath caught in his throat. "You think the trays I found, you think they were a message?" The veteran looked him dead in the eye, his expression unblinking and serious. "No," he said with chilling certainty. "I think you were never meant to see them at all." It was then that the pieces started clicking into place, forming a terrifying picture. Hakamoto's crew wasn't just a group of kitchen workers. They were an invisible power structure within Kirohane prison. They were trusted by certain guards, feared by every inmate, and rumored to be tied to a network outside these walls that 40,181 couldn't even begin to imagine. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar running down the side of his face, looked like he carved discipline into people for sport. His name was Ryoji Hakamoto, prisoner 16604. The whispers in the cell blocks said that before Kirohane, Hakamoto had run a massive logistics chain for a powerful Tokyo crime syndicate. And here, in the isolated world of Kirohane prison, logistics meant one thing: food. Food was leverage. And leverage, in a place like this, meant absolute, unquestionable control. As 40181 turned to go back to the clattering conveyor, he felt a pair of eyes burning into the back of his head. It wasn't a guard. It was Hakamoto himself, watching him from across the room with an unnerving stillness. The midday shift began, and the minutes crawled by. Then, without any warning, Hakamoto approached. His presence was like a sudden drop in temperature. The entire line of inmates stiffened, their movements becoming robotic and tense. He stopped just inches from 40181, invading his personal space. "Inspection duty, huh?" Hakamoto's voice was low and calm, but it carried a dangerous edge. 40181 could only manage a cautious nod. Hakamoto reached out, picked up a fresh tray from the moving line, and tapped the lid with his finger. The sound was sharp, deliberate. "You flagged a few yesterday." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "I thought something was wrong," 40181 managed to say, his own voice sounding weak and thin. Hakamoto leaned in even closer, so close that 40,181 could smell the metallic tang of sweat on his skin. But nothing was wrong. Right. Silence. A thick, heavy silence descended around them. A guard watched from a catwalk above, his face impassive. He said nothing. Of course he said nothing. Hakamoto was in charge here, not the men in uniform. A slow, knowing smirk spread across Hakamoto's face. I run this place, he said, his voice a low growl. Not them. He jabbed a thick finger at the endless stream of trays. And if you want to survive your shift, you'll remember this one rule. Inspect what's real, and you ignore what's political. He turned to walk away, the moment seemingly over. But then he stopped and added over his shoulder, a final, chilling note of warning. You're new. I'll give you one mistake. Just one. The conveyor kept moving, the rhythm of the kitchen unchanged, but 40,181's hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the trays. He felt like he was standing on a cliff edge. By the time the evening meal was served, the story had already spread through the cell blocks like wildfire. Everyone knew that the new guy, 40181, had been talked to by Hakamoto. The reaction was immediate. Some inmates started avoiding him, their eyes darting away whenever he got close. Others watched him from a distance, their faces unreadable, calculating whether he was a threat, a liability, or just another fool destined for a short stay. But later, during the brief yard time under the gray, overcast sky, the veteran inmate approached him again. He moved with the same quiet purpose as before. Hakamoto doesn't warn people, he said, getting straight to the point. The words hung in the cold air. 40181 looked at him, his mind racing. Then why warn me? He asked, the question that had been tormenting him for hours. The veteran's eyes held a strange, knowing look. Because someone else expected you to react differently. Who? 40181 pressed, desperate for a real answer. You'll find out soon enough. Before 40181 could ask anything more, a shrill whistle cut through the yard. Time was up. As the inmates were herded into lines to be marched back to their cells, 40,181 noticed something. Two guards were speaking quietly near the main gate. They were trying to be discreet, but one of them pointed directly at him. The other guard nodded. Something cold and icy, like a sliver of glass, slid down his spine. He wasn't just being watched by the prisoners. Back in the suffocating silence of his cell that night, he tried to make sense of the tangled web he'd fallen into. A prison kitchen, a criminal crew controlling the food supply, corrupt guards who looked the other way, and a set of tampered meal trays that felt like when the heavy steel doors to the iron kitchen clanked open, 40181 felt a different kind of tension in the air. It wasn't the raw fear of a newcomer anymore. This was a calculated alertness, the feeling you get walking into a room where everyone already knows your name and is waiting for you to make a move. He scanned the room. The veteran inmate who had guided him yesterday wasn't on shift. In their usual corner, Hakamoto's crew huddled together, whispering in low, guttural tones. And the guards watched him with a particular kind of interest, the way you watch someone who is about to break a rule you secretly want them to break. Something was coming. Something had been carefully arranged. He took his place at the inspection line, the familiar metallic scent of steam and disinfectant filling his lungs. The conveyor belt shuddered to life, its rhythmic clanking a grim metronome counting down to something. Steam hissed from the pipes above, shrouding the room in a hazy fog. The familiar rhythm of the kitchen returned. For 10 minutes, everything was normal. Trays slid past. He checked the seals, the weight, the contents. Everything was mechanical, repetitive. Then, tray number 117 slid toward him. It looked perfect. The rice was molded just right, the vegetables arranged with unusual precision. But as he lifted it, his fingers registered a subtle difference. The bottom felt heavier, just slightly. A whisper drifted from the inmate behind him, so low it was almost lost in the din. Keep moving. 40,181's hands froze for a fraction of a second before he forced them to continue their work. He ignored the whisper. He lifted the tray again, giving it a gentle, almost imperceptible shake. Something inside shifted. It wasn't food. It felt like paper. He glanced around the kitchen. No one seemed to be watching him directly, but that meant nothing. Inside Kirohane, someone was always watching. His heart hammered against his ribs. He pressed his thumb against the tray's plastic seal. It loosened far too easily, as if it had been opened and resealed. Beneath the perfectly steamed rice, almost invisible, was a tiny waterproof packet. His fingers, clumsy with adrenaline, worked it free. Inside the packet was a folded note. 2 lines, written in small, neat script. "Stay away from Hakamoto." And the second line made his blood run cold. "You're not here by accident." His pulse spiked. This was a direct message. Someone was communicating with him. Someone with access to the food trays, a position of incredible trust and risk. Someone who was willing to risk everything just to warn him. But who? And why? He quickly resealed the tray, his movements practiced and smooth despite his trembling hands, and sent it down the line. A guard near the end of the conveyor glanced his way, his eyes lingering for a moment too long. 40181 forced his face into a mask of bored indifference. Seconds later, a shadow fell over his workstation. He didn't need to look up to know who it was. Hakamoto. The man stepped closer, his bulk seeming to absorb the noise of the machinery around them. "You work slower today," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Just being careful," 40181 replied, keeping his eyes fixed on the moving trays. Hakamoto nodded slowly, a predator assessing its prey. He tapped a nearby tray with a thick knuckle. "You know what I like about this place? The kitchen never lies. You can learn everything about a man from how he handles food. Every secret, every weakness." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But what I can't figure out is why someone like you was assigned here." 40181 swallowed, the sound loud in his own ears. "Someone like me?" Before Hakamoto could answer, a figure appeared beside them, moving with surprising speed. It was the veteran inmate from yesterday, the one who wasn't supposed to be on shift. "Sir," the veteran said, his voice cautious but firm, addressing Hakamoto. "Number 40181 needs to switch stations. He's been flagged for orientation review." It was a lie. A bold, breathtakingly dangerous lie, spoken directly to the most feared man in the kitchen. Hakamoto's eyes narrowed into slits, shifting from the veteran to 40,181 and back again. "Is that so?" The air grew thick with unspoken threats. The veteran held his gaze and gave a single, firm nod. A tense silence stretched between them, a silent battle of wills fought over the roar of the kitchen. Then, Hakamoto let out a slow, deliberate breath, a smirk twisting his lips. "Fine. Move him." The veteran wasted no time. He grabbed 40,181's arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and guided him away from the line, past the steaming vats and clattering carts, until they were out of earshot. "You got something in a tray, didn't you?" the veteran asked, his voice low and urgent. 40181 hesitated for a beat, his mind racing. He looked into the older man's worried eyes and made a choice. "Yes." The veteran closed his eyes for a moment, as if confirming a deep-seated fear. "You're in the middle of 2 forces you don't understand," he whispered, his gaze darting around the room. "Hakamoto is one. The guards who enable him are another. But there's a third group, quiet, careful, older inmates who know this prison better than the officers themselves. We've been watching you. Why warn me?" 40181 asked, his voice barely audible. "Because you were transferred here too quickly," the veteran explained. "Your file is too clean, too empty. No disciplinary marks, no gang affiliations. A perfect work history, perfect behavior. In a place like Kirohane, that doesn't happen. It's impossible." He leaned closer, his voice dropping even lower. "You were placed here for a reason, and I'm starting to believe it wasn't your crime that brought you here." Before 40181 could process the words, a siren blared. A piercing, chaotic sound, different from the previous day's shift change alarm. Guards rushed into the kitchen, their faces tight with urgency. Hakamoto's crew stiffened, their hands balling into fists. "What's happening?" 40,181 whispered. The veteran's face drained of all color. "That's the contamination alarm." Across the block, inmates instinctively backed away from the conveyor belt. A guard shouted over the siren's wail. "Everyone step away from the trays." Then another guard's voice cut through the noise, laced with panic. "Find the source. Someone tampered with the new batch." 40,181's stomach twisted into a knot. Not again. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a setup. And the timing, right after he received the note. The veteran's hand shot out and gripped his wrist tightly. Listen to me. When the guards start clearing the line, slip out through the back corridor. There's a storage room behind the rice boilers. Someone will meet you there. Who? 40,181 demanded. You'll see. Why should I trust you? Because if you stay here, the veteran said, his voice trembling with a terrifying certainty, Hakamoto will make sure you don't survive the next shift. Chaos erupted. Guards were shouting orders, trays clattered to the floor, and the industrial roar of the kitchen machinery ground to a sudden, jarring halt. In the confusion, 40181 saw his chance. He took one step backward, then another, melting into the shadows. He slipped into the dim corridor behind the boilers, the air immediately growing hotter, heavier. It was darker here, the noise of the main kitchen muffled to a dull roar. He moved slowly, his every nerve on fire. At the far end of the corridor, a silhouette emerged from the shadows. An older inmate. He had a thin frame, a shock of white hair, and eyes that looked like they had seen every secret this prison had ever held. 40181, the man said softly, his voice calm amidst the distant chaos. We need to talk. 40181 froze, his back pressed against the warm metal wall. You know my number? The old man nodded slowly. I know why you're here, and I know what they're planning to do with you. 40,181's breath caught in his chest. 1,000 questions swirled in his mind, but only one came out. What do you mean? The man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. You weren't brought to Kirohane to work in the kitchen. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. You were brought here to replace someone. 40181 stared at him, his mind struggling to comprehend. Replace who? The old man leaned in, his lips close to 40,181's ear, and whispered a name. A name that sent an icy chill down his spine. A name he recognized instantly. A name he was never, ever supposed to hear inside these walls. The old man's voice, it was heavy, you know? It just cut right through the heat of that prison corridor. He leaned in, and his whisper, it trembled, like he'd been holding on to these words for years. You were brought here, he said, to replace prisoner 26719. I frowned, my prison number, 40181, feeling heavier than usual. I don't know who that is. He gave me this sad little smile. You wouldn't. They erased him. A chill, a real one, snaked down my spine. He worked your position, the old man went on. Inspection duty. He was a quiet guy, followed every single rule. But he found something in the meals. The exact same thing you just found. The tampered trays? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. It was more than that, he replied. He found patterns. Certain inmates getting sick, poisoned. Certain guards making sure to avoid specific food batches. He tried to report it. My mind raced. Who was behind it? Hakamoto. Hakamoto was the enforcer, the one everyone feared. No. The old man shook his head slowly. Hakamoto just keeps the system running. He doesn't control it. He took another step closer, his voice tightening. The real power is the administration. They use this kitchen to test things. Food preservatives, chemical additives, cheap formulas they get from government contracts. If something goes wrong, they just call it a prison illness. Case closed. No one asks any questions. I felt the blood drain from my face. N26719. I whispered, almost afraid of the answer. The old man's eyes got dark. He was taken from the kitchen one morning. The official story? He fought a guard and got transferred. But we saw it. We watched them empty his cell in the middle of the night. The men who did it, they weren't wearing prison uniforms. He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. And the very next day, a new prisoner suddenly appeared on the roster. A clean file. A work history that was just perfect for handling food. I froze. It was like a puzzle piece slamming into place. Everything started to make a terrifying kind of sense. My ridiculously fast transfer, the squeaky clean file, the strange looks from the guards, the anonymous warnings slipped under my food trays. I took a step back. But why me? What do they want? The old man let out a shaky breath. They think you're a pushover. That you'll just do the job, look the other way, and ignore the tampering. And if you see too much, he tapped the floor with his foot. You'll disappear just like 26719 did. Before I could even respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed down the corridor. Guards. The old man grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. Listen to me. When they find you, and they will, don't deny anything. Don't accuse anyone. They're testing you right now. Just follow my lead. The corridor lights flickered, casting long, creepy shadows along the walls. And then, at the far end, Hakamoto appeared, flanked by 2 guards. His face was a mask, completely expressionless, but his eyes held something: disappointment. 40181, he said, his voice calm, which was somehow more frightening. You walked off the line. That's a serious violation. 2 guards stepped forward. The old man's whisper was a ghost in my ear. Stay still. My entire body locked up. Hakamoto approached, slow and deliberate, like a predator. I warned you, he said. I gave you protection, but you just had to cross the wrong people. He leaned in close, his voice so low I could barely hear it over the hum of the boilers behind us. You're too observant. And in this prison, that's a dangerous thing to be. I felt the guards grab my arms, their grips like iron. This was it. I was done for. But then, a voice echoed from behind Hakamoto. Stop. It was the senior kitchen officer. The same guy who had barely said 2 words to me since I arrived. He walked past Hakamoto and handed a sealed document to one of the guards. This prisoner has been reassigned, he said, his tone flat. Effective immediately. Hakamoto's eyes widened, just for a second. Reassigned? To where? The officer didn't even blink. Laundry block. No more kitchen duty. Higher orders. Hakamoto just stood there, clenching his jaw, staring at me like I was a puzzle he couldn't solve. He finally stepped back. The guards released my arms. The old man whispered, someone on the outside is protecting you. You need to find out who. But I barely heard him. My heart was a drum against my ribs. Reassigned? Protected? Who in the world? Before I could process any of it, the senior officer spoke to me quietly. 40181, you will never return to this kitchen. Forget everything you saw. But the look in his eyes told a completely different story. It said, don't you dare forget. Understand what's happening. As they escorted me out of the iron kitchen for the last time, I glanced back. Steam rising from the vats. Trays clattering on the line. Inmates working like robots. Hakamoto glaring at me with pure hatred. And the old man, raising 2 fingers to his forehead in a silent signal. A warning. Keep watching your back. That afternoon, I entered the laundry block. Different machines, different noise, but the same terrifying truth followed me. I had stumbled into a secret system of human testing, silent power plays, and dangerous men who controlled every single meal in Kirohane prison. And now, I finally understood the unspoken rule whispered to me on my very first day: never eat what you make. Because in Kirohane, the food wasn't just food. It was a weapon. It was a message. It was a method of absolute control. And only one thing was guaranteed. No one truly knew what went into those meals, except for the men who were willing to kill to keep it hidden. If that story rattled you even half as much as it rattled the inmates of Kirohane prison, then you already know what to do. Hit that like button, smash subscribe, and share this video with someone who thinks they know how prison meals really work. And drop a comment below. Should I uncover more hidden prison operations from around the world? Or should we dive even deeper into Japan's secret detention system? Your engagement is what pushes stories like this into the light. And trust me, the next one will be even darker. See you in the next episode. Stay curious and stay safe.